The sky over Prestonville, a small town in central Texas, was clear as it was on most warm nights in September. The streets were asleep, and so were the houses, surrounded by manicured lawns and perfectly trimmed hedges. Outside of town, only a deserted road led inland, where vast plains and sparse farms spread out. Life in Prestonville was quiet, as it should be for a town of less than 5,000 people. The Walker family home was unremarkable among other similar two-story houses. Neighbors knew them as a well-to-do family. Father Thomas Walker, a successful realtor, Mother Linda Walker, a housewife, and their 19-year-old daughter Emily. Thomas and Linda were typical middle-class Americans. They took pride in their home and a life built on prosperity and family tradition. No one in the neighborhood suspected that behind the facade of the perfect family lurked something disturbing. It all began on the evening of September 14, 2021. There was a familiar silence in the Walker home. Thomas sat at his laptop in his first-floor study, researching market offers, preparing for an important transaction. Linda was in the kitchen preparing a late dinner. Emily was sitting in her upstairs room, but her door was tightly shut and no one knew what she was doing. At 11:30 p.m., neighbors across the street noticed the lights in the Walker house suddenly go out. It didn't attract their attention. It happened when Thomas or Linda forgot to pay the electric bill, though that was rare. No one suspected anything unusual that night. An hour later, around 00:30, a neighbor's dog began barking furiously. The dog was known for his nervousness, but that night his barking was shrill and loud, causing the Walker's neighbor, Jerry Parker, to look out the window. He saw nothing in the darkness, but the feeling of unease lingered with him. In the early morning hours of September 15th, a furniture delivery truck pulled up to the Walker home. Linda and Thomas had ordered a new living room set the day before, but no one came out to meet the driver. The trucker rang the doorbell, knocked, but there was no answer. Without a moment's hesitation, he left the goods at the front door and drove away. At 10:15 a.m., when Linda was supposed to be at the weekly meeting of the local women's club, her absence alerted her friends. She never missed a meeting unannounced. One of the women called Linda, but her cell phone was off. Half an hour later, Linda's friend, Martha, decided to stop by her house to see if everything was okay. When Martha pulled up to the house, she noticed a strange thing. The delivered boxes of furniture were still standing by the front door. She tried knocking on the door, but no one answered. Looking out the window, Martha saw that all the curtains were tightly closed, even though Linda usually left them open. Finally, Martha called Thomas. His cell phone was also turned off. Then the woman decided to call the police. The officers arrived a few minutes later. No one knew what to expect, but everyone deep down hoped it was just a misunderstanding. When the police officers arrived at the door, they immediately noticed that the door was unlocked. One of the officers opened it and cautiously stepped inside. The house was in absolute silence. The policemen walked through the hall, examining the rooms one by one. The first thing they discovered was the body of Linda Walker lying in the kitchen. She was lying face down on the floor in a pool of her own blood. Several stab wounds in her back left no doubt. She had been murdered. At first glance, it looked like a spontaneous attack, but there were no signs of forced entry or burglary in the house. Everything looked in place except for one thing. The family photos on the walls had been ripped off and scattered on the floor, as if someone had deliberately tried to destroy them. Moving on, the police officers made their way to Thomas's office. They found him sitting in a chair with the marks of several gunshots to the chest. Apparently, he was taken by surprise. No weapon was found at the scene, but there were no signs of a struggle, reinforcing the suspicion that the killer was someone close to him. Everything seemed to happen quickly and with purpose. The killer knew what he was doing and knew his victims. The police officers continued their search of the house and went up to the second floor where Emily's bedroom was located. The door to her room was closed. The officers knocked, but no one answered. Upon opening the door, they found the room in perfect order, but Emily was nowhere to be found. The disappearance of Thomas and Linda's daughter only made matters worse. Had she been kidnapped? Or had she run away? Police officers began searching the neighborhood, checking surveillance cameras at nearby homes and retail outlets. By the evening of September 15th, the whole city knew about the double murder. People debated various theories, but one thing seemed certain. This was no random crime. The Walkers had been purposefully murdered, and the prime suspect was their own daughter, Emily. Meanwhile, the police discovered that Emily had been having trouble with her parents for the past few months. She had been seen several times in the company of questionable people, but no one thought it could lead to something so horrible. Neighbors recalled that there had been frequent arguments at the Walker home recently, but no one could have imagined it would go this far. Hours later, after examining the crime scene, police found Emily's car on the outskirts of Prestonville. The car was parked by the curb, as if it had just been abandoned. Inside were her belongings, her backpack, her papers, but Emily was still missing. Her parents' bodies had already been sent to the morgue, and the police continued to search for traces of her. The first thing investigators noticed was surveillance footage from neighboring streets. On the night of the murder, around 11:40 p.m., one of the cameras captured a figure resembling Emily leaving the house through the backyard and heading toward her car. This footage heightened suspicions of her involvement. During further investigation, police discovered that in the weeks prior to the murder, Emily had purchased a firearm and had visited a shooting range on the outskirts of town on several occasions. This indicated that she was preparing for the crime. Moreover, several diaries were found in her room in which she wrote down her thoughts and experiences, many of which were filled with hatred and despair. The police noticed the last entries in her diary. In them, Emily described her difficult relationship with her parents, especially with her father, with whom she often had conflicts. She felt isolated and depressed in their home, as she herself wrote, "like a prison." One of the last leads that helped police continue their investigation was a statement from one of her friends who saw Emily on the evening of September 14th. He claimed that she was in an extremely agitated state, talking about how she needed to work something out with her parents and that she could no longer live under their control. That conversation, according to the friend, was the last thing he heard from her. When police began checking Emily's phone records, it was discovered that on the night of the murder, she had called a number that was registered to an unknown person on multiple occasions. That number was soon identified as the phone number of a person associated with an underground arms trafficking network. The investigation focused on finding possible accomplices who could have assisted Emily in her plan. By the morning of September 16th, the search for Emily had expanded across the state. On September 16th, 2021, with the first rays of dawn, the city of Prestonville awoke to a new reality. The double murder of Thomas and Linda Walker shocked the locals. Reports of their daughter Emily's disappearance spread quickly, and now more and more people were taking part in the search for her. Police patrols scoured neighborhoods, outlying areas and farms, and helicopters with thermal imaging cameras circled Prestonville and the surrounding area. While detectives pieced together the pieces of this tangled story, the forensic team continued to work at the Walker home. Every little detail caught their attention. Although at first glance nothing was stolen and there were no obvious signs of robbery, minor details raised questions. For example, there were still unfinished wine glasses on the dining room table, but one of them, judging by the prints, belonged to Emily, though she rarely drank alcohol. Was this an act of display before the crime or a failed attempt to go unnoticed? Forensic experts examined every inch of the kitchen where Linda was found. The bloody marks on the tiles showed that the killer moved methodically, struck, and then calmly left the scene. The blood trails ended at the staircase, indicating that the perpetrator went upstairs, where Thomas's office was located. His papers were found on the desk in front of him, which meant that the attack had happened unexpectedly, perhaps while he was concentrating on his work. Meanwhile, pathologists were performing autopsies on the bodies. Judging by the nature of the wounds, Linda was killed first, using a kitchen knife found near her body. Thomas was shot, and the bullets from his body were sent for ballistics testing. But the key discovery was the time of death. The murders occurred 15 to 20 minutes apart, indicating careful planning. While the experts continued their investigation, police began analyzing Emily's phone records. The last calls were made on the night of September 14th, but the most important of them turned out to be a number associated with one of the arms dealers. The police already knew that she had purchased a gun shortly before the murder, and now it was up to them to figure out who she might have had contact with. Based on this information, investigators came upon Joshua Murphy, a local Prestonville resident who had a prior conviction for illegal gun trafficking. He was known for selling guns without a license and not questioning his customers' motives. Joshua denied any involvement in the crime, but the fact that he sold guns to Emily left a trail. However, there was no evidence linking him to the murder itself. Police officers began examining surveillance footage from cameras in the neighborhood. One of the cameras on a nearby street recorded Emily's car that night. The footage clearly showed her leaving the house at 11:40 p.m., just after the murders were committed. The movement of the car did not betray any particular hurry, as if she knew she had time. Traces of her car were lost a few miles from the house, at an intersection of roads leading into the wilderness. Meanwhile, the police had discovered a new piece of evidence in the case: a farewell letter left by Emily in her room. It was in a desk drawer, hidden under a pile of old photographs and school notebooks. The letter didn't directly confess to the murder, but the tone in which it was written indicated the underlying conflicts and rage she felt toward her parents. Emily complained of constant pressure, control, and lack of freedom. In the letter, she alluded to an ultimate solution that would rid her of those who had broken her life. Although there was no direct indication of murder, it became an important psychological clue for the investigation. Based on all this information, the police began to hypothesize that Emily had carefully planned the murder of her parents. She used a gun purchased from Murphy and a knife she took from the kitchen to carry out her actions methodically and in cold blood. She left the house after making sure both parents were dead and abandoned the car in a remote neighborhood, hoping to confuse the police. At the same time, the local media began hyping the story, and rumors spread throughout Prestonville. Residents of the town, shocked by the brutality of the crime, began to search for explanations. Some claimed that Emily suffered from mental illnesses that her parents knew about but didn't talk about. Others thought it could have been the result of her connection to the underworld. Police officers did not exclude any version, but all agreed on one thing: Emily was the main suspect. However, despite the evidence gathered, the search for Emily herself continued to stall. Thorough searches of the surrounding neighborhoods yielded no results. She seemed to have disappeared without a trace, but for the police, it was only a matter of time. With so many resources deployed, it was only a matter of time before they found her. On the third day of the search, September 17, police found an old abandoned house on the outskirts of Prestonville. The house belonged to Walker's long-gone relatives and was rarely visited. Police officers decided to check out the location because it was not far from where Emily's car was found. When the officers went inside, they immediately sensed a strange atmosphere. The house was empty, but on the first floor there were old boxes and furniture covered in dust. There was no sign of human occupancy until they went up to the second floor. There, in a small bedroom, they found traces that indicated a recent presence. Scattered on the floor were several empty bottles of water and packages of food bought from a local store. This indicated that someone had been hiding here recently, possibly Emily. But she herself wasn't there. However, an important piece of evidence was found in the house: Emily's cell phone. It was lying on an old armchair, almost empty. The police immediately seized it for further examination. Upon close inspection, it became clear that Emily had used it until the last moment, sending messages to unknown numbers and making notes. One of the last messages was a short, "I'm ready." To whom it was addressed remained unknown, but for the investigators it became the key to further searches. In parallel, the police began working with psychology experts to understand what might have driven Emily to such actions. Examination of her diaries, correspondence, and friends' memories pointed to deep psychological trauma, possibly caused by family dynamics. Emily, according to friends, was always quiet and withdrawn. Her parents, especially her father, were strict and demanding, which may have been a catalyst for the accumulated hatred. That same day, police received another important tip. A witness reported seeing a girl resembling Emily near a bus station in the neighboring city of Waco. Officers immediately went to the scene, checking all possible cameras and interviewing station employees. They were soon able to find footage of a girl who actually resembled Emily buying a ticket for a bus bound for the southern part of Texas. The ticket was purchased for a flight to San Antonio, which became a new target for police to search for. The questions continued to multiply. Emily was leaving footprints, but her motives remained murky. Police believed she may have gotten outside help. Analysis of her phone calls and messages led to several potential contacts that were linked to criminal elements. Suspicion fell on people who could have involved Emily in deeper networks of illegal activity. Meanwhile, forensics continued to analyze the evidence found at the crime scene. Ballistics testing confirmed that the gun used. On September 17, 2021, the search continued for Emily Walker, who investigators believed was the prime suspect in the murder of her parents, Thomas and Linda Walker. Police and forensic investigators stepped up their efforts, hoping to gather all possible evidence that could lead to her capture and uncover the full motive for the crime. On the morning of the third day of the investigation, ballistics testing confirmed that the gun used in Thomas's murder was the same gun Emily had purchased from Joshua Murphy. This reinforced suspicions of her direct involvement in the crime. Now the investigation had to reconstruct the entire chain of events and understand where Emily might have gone after the murder. Police were actively checking surveillance footage from surveillance cameras located on major highways leading out of Prestonville. Footage from one of the cameras on Interstate 77 confirmed that Emily's vehicle was traveling southbound shortly after the murder. The footage recorded that the car stopped at one of the exits, where Emily apparently switched to another vehicle. She left the car on the side of the road, making no attempt to conceal it. This discovery gave police a new lead. If Emily had transferred to another vehicle, she may not have been acting alone. Investigators hypothesized that she may have had an accomplice who helped her get away. Messages sent from Emily's phone, found in the abandoned house, reinforced suspicions. Analysis showed that she was in touch with someone who supported her throughout the operation. The phone contained several texts sent with short phrases that looked like code messages. The investigation began analyzing Emily's contacts, trying to determine who she may have been cooperating with. However, her entourage did not provide direct answers. Friends and acquaintances claimed that Emily was withdrawn and did not have an active social life. But among the found numbers were several unknown subscribers, the connection with which strengthened the suspicions of investigators. One of these numbers belonged to a man named Brian Salter, who had been linked to local criminal gangs in the past. The investigation suggested that he was the man who may have been the one to assist Emily in covering her tracks. While the police searched for Brian, detectives continued to delve into the Walkers' personal life. Emily's parents seemed to be quite respectable people, but some details of their family life began to raise questions for the investigation. From conversations with relatives, it became known that the relationship between Thomas and Linda was far from ideal. Thomas, a successful businessman, was strict and demanding both to his wife and daughter. Linda, according to stories, often suffered from psycho-emotional pressure from her husband. Emily, on the other hand, being the only child in the family, grew up under the constant control of her father. These family problems may have been the basis for the hatred and alienation that Emily had accumulated over the years. On her laptop, forensics found a diary where she described her feelings toward her parents. Recent entries indicated that she was preparing for the final solution, mentioning her desire to sever all ties with her family. Although there was no direct mention of a plan to kill, the notes contained frightening hints of violence. While the investigation delved into Emily's psychological state, the forensics team returned to analyzing the crime scene. One of the key questions was how Emily was able to commit the murders with such cold blood and thoroughness. The experts noted that the murders were committed with a high degree of premeditation. Judging by the location of the bodies and the nature of the wounds, Emily had acted methodically. This suggested that she planned the crime in advance and studied ways to minimize the likelihood of detection. Meanwhile, the interview with Brian Salter yielded new details. He denied any involvement in the crime, but admitted that he had been in contact with Emily shortly before she disappeared. Brian confirmed that Emily had approached him for help in purchasing a gun, explaining that it was necessary for self-defense. He also mentioned that she had expressed deep anxiety about her relationship with her parents, But he did not suspect that her anxiety would escalate into such a violent crime. According to Brian's testimony, he was unaware of Emily's plans for the murder, but recalled that she was looking for a place to hide after it was all over. He mentioned several possible hideouts around San Antonio where criminal elements sometimes hid from police. The police did not pay much attention to this information, as Brian was known for his penchant for hiding the truth. Against this backdrop, police continued to check other surveillance cameras on the road from Prestonville toward San Antonio. One camera captured Emily in the company of an unidentified man at a bus station in Waco. They bought tickets together, and the man appeared to be accompanying her on the trip. Emily appeared calm and collected, as if everything was going according to plan. The information she received about her alleged partner was a key lead for the police. Officers began searching for the man through surveillance footage and also checked his connection to known criminal elements. Meanwhile, a team of cybersecurity experts began examining Emily's social media and electronic devices. It was important to understand who she was corresponding with and what steps she was taking in preparation for the murder. As the investigation moved forward, analyzing new evidence, attention was focused on a missing man caught on cameras at the bus station. Police put together a sketch based on the surveillance footage and sent it around the neighborhood. The man began to be sought as a possible accomplice and witness in the case. The next day, September 18, police received a tip. A cab driver in San Antonio reported seeing a man resembling the wanted man near a cheap motel area on the outskirts of the city. Police officers immediately went to the scene. They soon discovered an abandoned motel that appeared to be used as a hideout for fugitives and drug dealers. In one of the rooms, rented on fake IDs, they found evidence of a recent stay by two people. Among the items left in the room was another cell phone, which it was later discovered also belonged to Emily. The phone was another important piece of evidence. Judging from its contents, Emily and her accomplice continued to move around South Texas. Recent reports indicated they were traveling toward the Mexican border, leading police to believe they planned to cross it and flee to another country. Now police faced a new challenge: intercepting the fugitives before they left U.S. territory. As investigators continued their probe, questions about Emily's motives continued to plague the police and psychologists involved in the case. Fragmentary records found in her phones and laptop pointed to deep psychological problems that may have developed amid prolonged parental pressure. Reconstructing the full picture of her motives was difficult, but it was now clear that the murders were not simply the result of a spontaneous decision, but a carefully thought-out action. By mid-September, the police had stepped up patrols on the roads leading to the border and sent out alerts to all border posts. The situation was becoming critical. The fugitives could cross the border at any time, and the police could not allow them to escape. On September 19, 2021, tensions among the investigation team reached a peak. Emily Walker and her accomplice continued to elude the police, and every hour increased their chances of crossing the border. The motives behind the brutal murder of her parents were still not fully understood, but with each new discovery and clue, the image of the fugitive became more and more frightening. Police patrols were heavily monitoring roads leading to the Mexican border. Texas Highway Patrol, National Guard, and Border Patrol agents were informed of a possible border crossing with the two suspects. The situation became critical. If Emily and her accomplice managed to cross into Mexico, their apprehension would become many times more difficult. Despite their best efforts, each new surveillance video showed that the pair were one step ahead. A fortuitous breakthrough occurred later that day. A surveillance camera at a gas station in the small town of Cotulla, about 110 miles from the Mexican border, captured a vehicle similar to the van used by the fugitives. Emily and her accomplice briefly got out to get gas and continued on their way, unaware they were being watched. Police immediately advanced to the location of their last stop. Emily was headed toward the small border town of Laredo, one of the main routes into Mexico. The investigative team coordinated their actions while trying to calculate the possible moves of the perpetrators. The car was identified as having been rented under a false name in a San Antonio suburb, confirming the assumption of a carefully planned operation. Emily appeared to continue to act coolly, making no mistakes that would lead to her apprehension. However, something changed in her behavior as the investigators began to see more and more obvious signs of stress, She acted quickly, but less carefully than she had during the initial phase of the escape. In Laredo, police set up several checkpoints on major roads and exits leading to bridges over the Rio Grande River linking the US and Mexico. These were strategic points through which criminals could cross the border. Texas Rangers working in the region joined the search and were ready to spring into action immediately. Emily and her accomplice had to be stopped before they reached the border. The tired and exhausted fugitive finally showed herself. Cameras at one of the motels at the entrance to Laredo recorded their arrival. Police immediately cordoned off the area, preparing a forceful operation. However, the pair appeared to have slipped away again. They left the van in a parking lot and took off on foot toward a less secured section of the border where control was minimal. The police, responding to the change in the fugitive's route, sent their men to vulnerable points on the border. However, a new problem arose. The area was home to many illegal migrant flows, making it difficult to find specific individuals among the many others. Meanwhile, detectives, analyzing the latest evidence, reconstructed a complete profile of Emily's mental state. Based on the results of psychological evaluations, it became clear that she suffered from deep emotional distress that had been carefully hidden for years. The pressure from her father, which translated into psychological control, had probably led to a dramatic exacerbation of her condition. The crime she had so carefully prepared for was an act of release. But subsequent actions indicated that her equanimity was beginning to crack. A little later, the police received another important report. A local resident had spotted two suspicious people attempting to cross the river in a small boat. This could have been their last attempt to cross. Police officers immediately went to the scene, accompanied by two border guard patrol boats. The area was remote, and if they managed to cross the Rio Grande, it would mean the end of the investigation on the American side. The night operation was in full swing. The searchlights of the patrol boats illuminated the river, trying to catch the slightest signs of movement. Finally, two figures in a small inflatable boat were spotted in the middle of the river. The border guards immediately began pursuit. The boat accelerated, and the fugitives attempted to reach the Mexican shore. Emily and her accomplice rowed with desperation, but the patrol boats were faster. After a few minutes, the boat was stopped, and the police officers forced the fugitives to surrender. At the scene of the arrest, Emily was in shock, her face contorted with a mixture of horror and frustration. Her accomplice, later identified as ex-convict and petty criminal Jason Miller, who had helped her escape, also offered no resistance. Both were arrested and transported back to Laredo. Meanwhile, at the investigative team's headquarters, analysis of the evidence found, including Emily's cell phones and personal records, continued. The final days before the murder were particularly important in understanding the girl's motivation. Psychologists noted a clear deterioration in her condition, expressed in disturbing and violent writings. Under pressure from her family, Emily wrote about her release plan, but her notes did not include detailed descriptions of the murder, only abstract thoughts about the end of the family bond. While Emily and Jason were in custody, the investigation was finalizing all the evidence. A detailed investigation revealed that Jason had helped Emily not only with the escape, but also with the organization of the crime. He was the invisible assistant who helped her think through the steps and provided the resources to carry out the plan. Although his direct involvement in the murder was ruled out, his role as an accomplice was clear. The investigation also reconstructed the chronology of the night of the murder. Emily, armed with the gun Jason had provided her, had planned in advance how and when she would commit the crime. She waited until late in the evening when her parents were asleep to act quickly and efficiently. Thomas and Linda did not expect the attack, and their deaths were almost instantaneous. The psychological pressures Emily had been subjected to over the years caused her complete internal collapse. Her actions were the result of a long accumulation of emotions and an inability to cope with what she perceived as suppression from her father. In recent months, her condition deteriorated to the point where she saw no other option but to destroy her family. At her trial, which took place several months after her arrest, Emily pleaded guilty but refused to comment on her actions or explain her motives. She appeared indifferent to everything that was happening, as if her will had been broken. Jason Miller also pleaded guilty to aiding and abetting the escape. Emily Walker's trial attracted national attention. The media covered the case extensively, emphasizing how an outwardly prosperous family could hide huge psychological problems behind a facade. Emily was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Jason Miller received 20 years in prison for accessory after the fact. The Walker case was a reminder that outward prosperity can hide deep family problems that sometimes end in tragedy. Although many have tried to find signs of mental illness or outside influences in Emily's actions, her crime remains remembered as one of the most shocking and brutal acts of family violence in Texas history.